Welcome to part two of the discussion of internal analysis. Again, this is Dr. Kent Gregory, and I'm following chapter 4, Frank T. Rothermel, Strategic Management, 5th edition. So, the next thing to discuss is the VRIO framework. And this is part of the resource-based view that we've been discussing. And here's the flow chart for it. So, the acronym VRIO stands for valuable, rare, costly to imitate, and organized to capture value. So you pose the question, is the resource, capability, or the competency valuable? And if it's yes, then you go on. If the answer is no, you're at a competitive disadvantage. If that resource or capability or competency is rare, then you move to the next stage. If it's not rare, you're at competitive parity. If you think about it, it's not rare. Your competitors, your peer companies, all have access to it and may have it as well. Next, is it costly to imitate? And if it is costly to imitate, then you can go on to the next stage, or in your analysis, you would go on to the next stage. But if it's not costly to imitate, you're at a temporary competitive advantage because ultimately your competitors may end up imitating it simply because there are no prohibitions, either from a cost or complexity perspective, to imitate what it is that you do or imitate that resource, capability, or competency. Now, if the firm is organized to capture value, then you are in a position, or rather the firm is in a position to attain sustainable competitive advantage. If it's not organized to capture that value, particularly on an ongoing basis, then you're at a temporary competitive advantage. So that's a theoretical VRIO framework, and it can be applied in your analysis or a strategic analysis of just about any firm, and that would include nonprofits as well. So there are things that are called isolating mechanisms, and these create barriers to imitation. They purposely or accidentally protect your resources, capabilities, or competencies of your firm, or that underlie your firm's competitive advantage. So how? Well, better expectations of future resource value. And this implies making an investment now that ultimately will pay off later. And when it pays off later, you're able to attain that competitive advantage, and it's too late for your competitors to imitate that resource. One example, or the example that the book gives, is suppose a real estate agent buys some land out in the country, kind of the far suburbs, for a relatively cheap price because the land's been undeveloped. And then maybe 5-10 years later, an interstate exchange comes through there. And then all of a sudden that value of the land becomes very high, and that real estate agent has it. At that point, he or she has attained that land or bought that land for a really cheap value compared to what it would be or what it would cost after that exchange is there. Then there's path dependence. And what this does is it describes a situation in which the options one faces in the current period or situation are limited by decisions made in the past. Now, a positive example of that they give is why is it that in Dalton, Georgia, you have the carpet industry? And first, that came about because shortly after World War II, manufacturing located to that area to basically take advantage of cheap labor and less regulations. And then there were some developments in terms of carpets that were made there. And as a result, we end up with the majority of carpet manufacture in the United States being done in and around Dalton, Georgia. That's a positive example of path dependence. A negative example, or one where path dependence hurt, was GM's initial attempts to imitate the electric vehicles. Other causal ambiguity, and this is essentially saying, trying to answer the question, or maybe says that it's unanswerable, that certain companies are able to pool all their resources together and gain a competitive advantage, and it can't be isolated to one particular event or thing or person. For example, Apple. And then there's social complexity. And social complexity is a situation in which different social and business systems interact with one another. And it creates a situation like causal ambiguity, because the complexity of those interactions are difficult to replicate in another industry or across companies. And then there's intellectual property. So this is a critical intangible resource that can provide a strong isolating mechanism. All right. So the dynamic capabilities view. So what are dynamic capabilities? Well, those are a firm's ability to create, deploy, modify, reconfigure, upgrade, and leverage its resources over time. So again, whenever we use the term dynamic, we're really talking about over time. Dynamic capabilities also help prevent a core rigidity, because they're constantly being upgraded or developed, and it prevents a former core competency from turning into a liability. So that's dynamic capabilities view. So value chain analysis. What is the value chain? The value chain are internal activities that a firm engages in when transforming inputs into outputs. So each activity adds an incremental value. So primary activities directly add value, support activities add value indirectly. So a great example of this, Beats Electronics. These are headphones designed in part by Dr. Dre. So that adds value to it because of his name and his reputation and the marketing. The packaging, so it's a premium unboxing experience is how they describe it. So it's nice, they come in nice boxes, and the boxes themselves are almost a piece of art. And then they also have superb displays in Apple stores. So each of those things add to the value of Beats Electronics. And by adding to the value, it means that they're able to charge more for them. Even though probably the best headphones out there are not Beats, but probably the Bose headphones. And this is not meant to be a plug for Bose. Okay, so value chain analysis, primary activities. So these are activities that add value directly, they transform inputs into outputs as the firm moves a product or service horizontally along the internal value chain. Kind of think of this as a conveyor belt. Some examples: supply chain management, operations, distribution, marketing and sales, and then after sales service. Support activities. These are firm activities that add value indirectly. And maybe it's because they're not in and of themselves directly touching the product or service that's being produced. So they're necessary to sustain the primary activities. For this, you think of research and development, information systems, human resources, which is responsible for hiring and training new employees, keeping the employees happy and satisfied. And then there's accounting and finance, and then the firm infrastructure, which includes things like processes, policies, and procedures. And here's a nice little schematic of how the value chain analysis fits together, with the primary activities down here, all these support activities up here. And then they come together to create the value, which is your margin here. And your margin is the difference between the value and then the cost, which is the price you charge, and the cost to produce that product or service. So SWOT analysis. This is really popular, but what is it? I'm sure you've probably heard of it. It simply stands for, it's an acronym that stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And this is probably the most basic of all internal analyses that a company can do. I'm frankly kind of biased against it. And the reason why is it's very simple. And while it's a great place to start, it's not a great place to end. And very often companies, organizations, nonprofits, and I can think of my own experiences doing strategic planning as part of the board of directors for various nonprofits. It always starts with a SWOT analysis, and too often it ends there. And I think the problem with the SWOT analysis is that it's very simplistic, and it doesn't deal with the necessarily as well as it could the interrelation between opportunities and threats. So there's some opportunities out there that can turn into threats. Same thing with strengths and weaknesses. So that's something to keep in mind. It's not a particularly nuanced way to look at it, and there are more complex analyses, particularly with the external environment. So while this is okay, it has to be seen in the context of the external environment. Another problem with the SWOT analysis is it's often conducted by the members of the firm or the organization themselves. And simply by being members of the firm or organization, they are biased. So there's not that third party objectivity that you would want in a good analysis. But there you go. That's the SWOT analysis, and that ends part 2 of internal analysis. Thank you very much.